Okay, so I will just read out the questions that I've sent you, and then if there will be some sub questions, I will ask in between. Yeah, could you explain the complexities of who is targeted in the USA with abortion ban or restrictions and how the consequences are playing out?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and letting me talk about this. So, there's 12 total abortion bans across the United States, which means it's just banned and criminalized in all cases. There's four that are 6-week bans, which is a total abortion ban. There's two that are 12-week bans. There's more that are 6 week. So part of what you're hearing already is that there's really legal chaos in the United States, state to state. And one thing I think is really important for your listeners is to understand just how big some of these states are. They are the size of European countries. So if abortion is inaccessible in your state, you have to fly thousands of miles if you can afford it to get abortion care. So, since the fall of Roe with the Dobbs decision in 2022, we've seen this patchwork of laws across individual states. At the beginning, I said we have 12 total abortion bans, four that are at 6 weeks, but ultimately, we just have abortion bans crisscrossing the country, and they're meant to be confusing. They're meant to be restrictive. So even when you see these laws that are supposed to have quote unquote so-called exceptions, so you can't have an abortion except if the life or the health of the pregnant person is at risk. They don't work, those exceptions, and they're not meant to work. They're meant to be total abortion bans. So across this country, hundreds of thousands of square miles, we have, which is hundreds of thousands of square meters, we have people who can't access abortion care. Amnesty International did research over last year, over the last 2 years, about the impact. And what we found were things that you would anticipate, that these abortion bans and restrictions and this criminalization is confusing. It's created a chill effect. Doctors are scared to just do gynecological services. There are OBGYN, so that, for a gynecological or obstetrician, or the folks who either for maternity care or just gynecological care, they're closing down clinics, they're closing down parts of hospitals. So there are hospitals that have closed down their delivery wards. This is where a person can go give birth, because you can't give birthing care without the option of abortion, because that might be needed in that moment, right? So we've seen the shutdown of hospitals, which have created, or of those wings in hospitals, which have created what we call care deserts. So a desert of healthcare where people now have to go more hundreds and thousands of miles to get any healthcare, including abortion care. We've seen the impact on people who can get pregnant is, of course, the most severe. And these are people who, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to continue a pregnancy, now have to figure out if they can travel, sometimes thousands of miles, if they can afford it, how they take off of work, what does it mean for their family? Most people who get an abortion in the United States already have children. So, how are they going to get childcare? So, it's impacted people, it's impacted communities, the families and people who love people who need abortion care. And it's certainly impacted the people who work for abortion care. So, in a state like Texas, which I think unfortunately most people are aware of because of its very bad laws, Texas is a huge state, and it has the third highest population, highest population, pardon me, in the United States of any state. And now you have something that's, thousands of miles of Texas where there's no abortion care. And more than that, there's a law in the state of Texas, because remember, every state makes its own law now. There's a law in the state of Texas which would criminalize even helping someone get abortion. So this could be if you drove your sister or your cousin to a different state, you could be criminalized. You could go to jail. In some states, they're pushing for the death penalty for abortion. I mean, it has just created a sea of fear and destruction. And what this means ultimately is that people are having to expend incredible amounts of resources to get the abortion care they need. They're delaying their abortion care. So, abortion care is happening later in pregnancies. Abortion is a very safe medical procedure or chemical procedure, but it is more safe the earlier you do it. And people are having to delay care because they can't find care. They're afraid to go to the doctor. We've seen women who don't want to go to the doctor at all for fear that they'll be documented as being pregnant. And ultimately, we've seen people being forced to give birth. that they have been forced by the state to remain pregnant and give birth. So it's an incredibly destructive landscape, and it's created, a country of fear for people who can get pregnant. We talked with people who were afraid to go on the internet to Google, how long after my missed period should I test to see if I'm pregnant, or what does it mean to be pregnant? The other thing to understand about the United States is we have terrible, terrible sexual and reproductive sex ed, so sexual education, sex and sexuality education. Education depends on the individual district. So almost every school gets to decide their own education within certain bounds. Like you have to test for math scores or some reading scores. But otherwise, every school district, which is a grouping of small schools, maybe in a city or in a county, gets to decide their own approach to education. And that means we have terrible sex ed across the United States. People don't know how you get pregnant. Not everybody does. And of course, rich people do know, right? Because they have access to information, because they have access to better education, because they have access to the tools to find out. And poor people are much less likely to know because they're in schools that are increasingly failing them, that don't have education. They can't access information. There might not be doctors in any part of a county if you're rural, so we're seeing this massive, massive destruction across the country. We've also seen other states. So again, we have 50 states in the District of Columbia in the United States. So Washington, D.C. is not a state, but it is a territory within the United States. We've seen states and the District of Columbia really step into roles of promoting and safeguarding abortion care. So a state like California, which is my home state and people have probably heard of because, of surfing and San Francisco, but this is a state where it's a huge state with the largest population of people in the United States that has really pushed through laws to protect abortion care, to help other people find abortion care and abortion support. There's also a network of grassroots, sometimes volunteer networks that help fund abortion care. So these are called abortion funds, usually. And these are a group of people, mostly volunteers, who work to get money to people who need abortion care. Because, as your listeners may know, in the United States, we don't have subsidized healthcare for everyone. We don't have socialized healthcare. You have to pay for your healthcare. And it's usually attached, almost always attached to your job, your employment. And so what this means is that poorer people don't have good health care, right? We do have a bottom line safety net people might have heard called Obamacare. It's called the American Health Care Act. But this is like the really bottomest line of care. And everything is expensive. Going to the dentist is expensive. And an abortion can be anywhere from $500 to $2,000 in the United States. And that's people just don't have that money. And so we have a network of volunteer funds and some that are workplace funds that help people get abortion. And those people and those funds and people all around are really coming together to make abortion care real and realized. The last thing I'll say is that one of the things that we documented was, a real sense of fear. But the other thing was of resilience. And so, for example, activists in Texas have been fighting, forever for better abortion care. Abortion care hasn't existed in Texas functionally way before Roe fell, way before the law was changed. The question was who could access it. And folks in these states, some of the most desperate legal situations, are fighting the hardest and are really, really dedicated and are rededicated to making sure that people can make the decision for themselves, whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term, can make the best decision for their families, and are able to access abortion care like all healthcare with dignity.
Yeah, luckily there is always somehow enough of political energy of people that really bring the situation to somewhere else than it could be in the worst case scenario. But all of this, yeah, you've mentioned already in general how the healthcare system in USA works is that uh, the poorest you are or in certain marginalized group, the more the less access you have to any kind of yeah, progress, social progress, or you know what I mean? And also all of these, what you were mentioning is really targeted, um, yeah, on those classes socially looking and
Mhm.
states that are the poorest in the country.
That's exactly right. And you have the states with the highest levels of maternal mortality. So this is preventable death because of pregnancy or birthing. The states with the highest rates of maternal mortality are also the ones that put in the strictest abortion laws. So these are states where it is already dangerous to be pregnant. It is already a gamble with your life to try and give birth if that's something you want to do. And now these states have the strictest abortion laws. And as you said, these impacts are not equal. The rich will always find a way to get the care they need because they have the money to travel, because they have the ability to get the information they need, and frankly, because they had the ability to pay for birth control ahead of time and they had so like the rich will always be able to get the care they need. And that, by the way, that includes people who are against abortion. 1 in 4 women in the United States, and we don't have the statistics for genderqueer or trans men who also need and receive abortion care, but 1 in 4 women in the United States will receive an abortion, at least one abortion in her lifetime. That is the same with Democrats and Republicans. It is the same with religious people and non-religious people. It is the same with Catholic people and Protestant people. Like the rich will always be able to find abortion care, including the people who quote unquote, don't support abortion. And that reality means that what's happening with this, which is happening with so many policies in the United States, is this is an attack on poor people. It is an attack on marginalized communities who, by the way, are also ethnically marginalized communities in the United States. You are much more likely to be poor in the United States if you're Black. You are much, much more likely to be poor in the United States if you are Indigenous. And that's because a series of laws, including this abortion law, disproportionately or sometimes intentionally target minoritized communities, and particularly ethnic and racially minoritized communities. So these types of abortion laws, and again, before Roe fell, these were the communities that struggled the most to get health care, that were the most disadvantaged by these laws, and sometimes purposely, right? And I think this is really important when we think about these laws, which is who do they benefit and who do they target? And there are people who believe in their hearts that abortion is wrong, that they have a religious view about it, right? But the people who are in power may or may not religiously believe that, but they have a real political reason to push this agenda. And the reason is that it speaks to a small minority of their base. And this is really important. Abortion is widely supported in the United States. People in America have very complicated views about abortion, but overwhelmingly, people oppose the criminalization of abortion. They support the right to have an abortion. Like this is not a particularly it's a complicated issue, but it is not this like 50-50 debate that we see in the news. There is certainly a minority of Americans, and it is growing. There's a minority of Americans who do oppose abortion in every instance, in every place. But when you poll people across the United States, the vast majority support abortion, at least through what the court has deemed as the first trimester, right? And they vastly disapprove of criminalizing abortion. So why is it happening? Because people in power and political power know that it is a rallying issue for a small, very vocal minority in their base. They know that they can gain political power with it. And also that in making people who live in poverty and minoritized communities less able to move from those circumstances, you are taking them away from political power. So abortion bans are also like an economic tool to keep the poor poor, and they're a political tool to keep those who would vote differently and vote maybe potentially even against the people who are passing these laws to keep them out of political power. So these laws, they're very clearly quote unquote about abortion, but they are also about keeping a certain power class in power in politics. And this is related to many, many, many other types of non-abortion laws, like the way we draw maps in the United States for political districts, like who gets to vote for which representative. There's a term you might have heard called gerrymandering, which is if you just draw the map just right in a certain state, you can make sure you're reelected every time. So even though the state might be 50% Democrat and 50% Republican, you can draw maps so that Republicans are the only ones who are elected to representative to Congress as a representative. In the Senate, in theory, the whole state votes, but you can also buy elections. If you have enough money, you can just win an election. Like you can get money, and corporations are now considered people in the United States for protection of speech, right? Like these are the people who benefit from like reducing political power, from keeping people in poverty, from keeping minoritized communities from unable to make choices for themselves. And that's part of what these abortion laws are. One of the very frustrating things is, some people who vote for candidates or politicians who are passing these laws also oppose restricting abortion, but they vote for these candidates who, because they rail against another issue, potentially like immigration, and there's deep seated racism in this country, and voting against your self interest because of some racist narrative. So these abortion laws are about a lot more than reproductive autonomy, because reproductive autonomy is about a lot more than just whether or not you have children and when you have them, right? It is about whether or not you can make decisions that will impact your financial future. It's about whether or not you can feed your children, whether or not you can keep yourself economically viable or safe in a country that demands you have money to exist, to have health care. So yeah, it's a really complicated issue, and it's really frustrating as it's continually and increasingly politicized, right? We're seeing this wave of far right movement in the United States, and it is growing, and that's really troubling. But even still, like the vast majority of Americans don't think we should criminalize abortion, and they think that someone should be able to decide for themselves at least through the first trimester, but that they can whether or not to carry a pregnancy.
Yeah, you already mentioned that it is an economic strategy as well, but it's so hard to grasp it, maybe how certain groups of people or corporations actually benefit economically through, yeah, making more people that are poor existing and
Mhm.
yeah, more people that are marginalized and oppressed. It's a bit like confusing because at the same time, when we are hearing them, how they are addressing those populations and yeah, how they are systemically
Mhm.
oppressing and keeping them in these
Mhm.
classes, like why would you like to make this population even bigger if publicly you are attacking this group?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of power in the United States is corporation power, right? And so there's a number of things. I mean, one, you have a divide in voting populations in the United States from people who think that they're much closer to being a billionaire than they are to being destitute in poverty. And they already maybe are very poor, right? But like there is this narrative in the United States that what is good for the billionaire class is good for you. And that has been very convincing to people, and particularly in economically marginalized communities, that like if we tax the rich, somehow that's bad for you. Which it's not, right? Like, but like ultimately, the richest people in the United States pay the little as the last, least, or no taxes, right? And actually, like people who are much less economically flush pay the most taxes. And so there's certainly been a decade, I mean, hundreds of years worth of convincing the American public that what's good for the most rich people in the United States is good for them. And that's because like the richest people in the United States have tons and tons and tons of money to campaign and do messaging campaigns and convince people that what's good for them is good for what's good for the rich is good for the poor, which is not true, of course. Um, the other is that people, again, this question of education, like we have a very low education community in the United States, and this can feel confusing because we have some of the best universities in the in the world, among others, and we have lots of higher education, and many people go to college, but decreasingly that is true. So that's for college education, and then for public education, which is high school and below, so you're until you're 18 and below, we have compulsory education. You have to go to school until you're 18 years old, right? And this is part of ensuring you have the right to education, is to ensuring children have to go. They can't be in the workforce. They need to go to school. But this again, like every school is different, and most of them are funded by taxes people vote on in their communities. And what this has meant, this change in the law, where you vote whether or not you're going to pass a tax for the school, is that schools are wildly underfunded. So you had classrooms with 40, 50 students in them for one teacher, like a second grade classroom, which is like, they'd be like 8 years old. So you have 8-year-olds and there's 40 of them in a classroom with one teacher. And that you can't do education like that. This is such an undereducated public, and increasingly undereducated public, that there's no, and this has been for generations, it's very hard to combat this sort of belief that what is good for rich people is also good for you. And ultimately, like corporations, there was a Supreme Court ruling that around free speech. So people will be very familiar with the United States Constitution, that the first, you have the right to freedom of speech, and this is a cornerstone right in our Constitution. It's one that is often on billboards. People like freedom of speech, freedom of speech. And what the United States Supreme Court ruled was that corporations have the right to free speech, by which they meant they could spend money in elections. So this was the Supreme Court ruling that ultimately, first of all, made human protections for corporations, and it meant that specifically on in how much they could spend in elections. And this was it was called Citizens United, the Supreme Court ruling. And this happened in 2000 and in the early 2000s, and or sorry 2010. And from that time, billions of dollars have been put into US elections by corporations. Billions of dollars. So if you have a mega company like Starbucks or Target, it doesn't matter, like just a company with a lot of money, increasingly tech companies, Apple, Twitter, Meta, right, who are pouring billions of dollars into US elections and messaging. That's the messaging people get. Those are the advertisements they see on their television. And if they only watch a certain so-called news channel, which is like Fox News, which people may have heard of, which is all just right-wing propaganda, it is not a news channel. But if that's what you watch 24 hours a day, which many people do, that's the only information you get. And the information you're getting over and over and over is that, X candidate is trying to take away your right by restricting a corporation, right? Their money. Like this is how corporate power has grown here. So we're increasingly seeing not an oligarchy, right? But a corporate garchy. We need a different word for it, which is like the corporations are the ones with power in the United States. Like corporate money is what drives education, laws, like elections, Congress. It's just so much corporate money. And they have no interest in keeping people educated, right? Their only interest is often in deregulation to make more money. I don't think that people at Twitter sit around twirling their mustaches, thinking around evil thoughts around like, oh, how can we restrict abortion, right? But they benefit from getting far right people into Congress because they're much less likely to regulate corporations, right? So that's that connection between things that seem very unrelated, which is the state of education in the United States, who has the right to put what type of money into an election, who's elected, who's voting for what. We also have a decreasingly democratic space where people aren't listening to their constituents in the way that they did. So a congressperson could hear from thousands of constituents, but they know that what you need to win an election is money, and in the end you can overcome negative votes with a lot of money. You can just you run 24 hours worth of messaging ads, and it's just propaganda. People hear this over and over and over again. So it's a really concerning space that we're in, not just in terms of abortion and not just in terms of other questions of reproductive or bodily autonomy. I mean, the attacks on, for example, trans kids in the United States. So if folks may have heard that there's just these relentless attacks against transgender people in the United States, particularly trans children, laws that are passed at the individual state level, for example, banning gender affirming care for minors, allowing the state to take away children from their parents if these children identify as trans, because the state deems that as child abuse, right? These are horrific laws at the state level, and they're meant to sow fear through the community, right? They are meant to eliminate trans people. It's horrific. And it's like, well, what does this have to do with abortion? Well, lots, like so many things. And the first is that it is the same people who are fighting against abortion rights, who are fighting against the rights of transgender people. Literally the same people, not like figuratively. It's literally the same people. It is literally the same organizations. It is literally the same fringe religious groups. They have a playbook, a literal book by which you go to state legislatures and try and pass these really regressive laws. The second is this is about bodily autonomy. Who gets to decide who controls your body? Who gets to control the body? And is it the person or is it the government, right? Or a religious power? And like that is really central. We're seeing a rise, and it's always been here, but the rise of white Christian nationalism in the United States. Again, this has always been here, to be very clear, but now we're seeing it in the halls of power, by which people who have very specific beliefs about who should be in power and what gender means. So this is a question of like white men who should be in power, and everyone else should be subservient for that. And those are the people pushing abortion bans, and there are people pushing trans bans, right? Because this idea of white supremacy relies on a diametric, men are one thing and women are another thing, and there's nothing else, right? This like binary gender and sex identification, and also that they have very different roles. So if you need politically a woman's role to be not power, to be not political, to be not working, right, is to be a child bearer, then you're going to pass a ton of anti-abortion laws, right? Because the white supremacy demands that. And we're seeing that come up too. So that, I mean, it's just a really, really complicated fight happening around, which is why we can have like a majority of people who support abortion rights. And again, people have complicated personal views about abortion, but they support the right to abortion, and yet still have this like a surge of elected representatives who are pushing the most radical anti-abortion, anti-trans agendas you can possibly imagine.
So this is a one way of, or one method to kind of separate people into different classes and keep them in those classes. And according to this analysis that we are reading for the podcast, it's, as I said, a method of growing or degrowing a population, and at the same time a way of accumulating money, as we were saying as well. Yeah, we shouldn't forget that the West has new imperialist wishes and expansions. And in this analysis, for example, it is also said that simply this is a method when more low-paid workforce and
Mm-hmm.
military class is needed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, this rise of corporate power and the rise of the visibility of white supremacy, like this country was founded on white supremacy, this is not new. But the political power has waxed and waned throughout American history, and the political power of white supremacy and of corporations is incredibly high, and for those to come at the same time and sort of meet in this place where both benefit from keeping the poor poor, and from keeping people out of political power, and from keeping minoritized communities not only without political power, but demonized, right? Folks will be seeing this incredible demonization of immigrants in the United States, and particularly black and brown immigrants, right? When they're white immigrants, people think about them very differently because of white supremacy. But this incredible demonization of immigrants, and that's happening across political parties. That is not just a far right thing, but that demonization comes from the right, and has infiltrated every part of American culture right now, which is if you're not making enough money, you know whose fault it is? Not corporations. It's an immigrant's fault, right? If your job is to you can't find a job, you know whose fault that is? Not corporations who have made your job go away, but immigrants, right? So there's no logic here, right? Like an immigrant has not made your groceries more expensive, an immigrant has not done these things. But like there's this the ability to create this what we call a straw man in English, something that's like the source of all your problems, right? The sort of demon of all your problems. And like you turn to immigration, and because these are people you can easily other. They are not like me, they are other. And this includes for people who have immigrated to this country, right? So, I mean, certainly my ancestors immigrated. Most people immigrated to this country unless they're indigenous or were brought over by chattel slavery, right? Everyone else immigrated to this country. And even people who have really close ties to immigration are increasingly like, oh, but I was the good immigrant. This is all bad. And this is the reason I don't have a job, because X person from Guatemala is trying to seek safety, right? This is the reason this is so successful, is because you have both corporate powers and you have financial reason to want to have a scapegoat, which is another English phrase. Like a scapegoat is the one you blame everything on, right? It financially advantageous to you to not have people question your role in their financial fixedness or their inability to get, so, to quote unquote get ahead in the United States. And part of this is what has often been called like the American dream. Like, what does this mean? The American dream, and there's lots of interpretations of it, but one very, very common is like, if you work hard enough, you can like get a house, you can be secure, you can have a couple kids, and you can live an okay life. Maybe you're not rich, but like if you work hard enough, you can like get a house, be secure, and like potentially get rich if you worked even harder. And this is part of the myth. If you just work hard enough, you could get rich, right? Which is not true. You have to be rich to get rich. But like this is not attainable for people now. We're looking at the first I mean, now we're on the second generation, millennials, who are people who were born kind of 1980 and maybe 10, 15 years after that to 1994 maybe. This is the first generation that will do worse than their parents. So every generation in the United States has improved a little bit in terms of economic stability. And now this generation, which is now like their 40s, right? They will do worse than their parents economically. They cannot afford to buy houses. And this is because of deregulation of the housing market. And like the rich can get incredibly rich on housing and like no one can afford, regular people can't afford to buy it. So corporations can, explode. But they have insecure jobs, they have insecure insurance, they're not sure if they can stay healthy, they're not sure if they can ever retire because we don't have a really good social net for a social security net for retirement. And the generation below them is going to do even worse. And so these are the conditions by which people come into this, and they need someone to blame. And corporations and the political right has done a very good job of saying, oh, it's not our fault. It's not our fault that we're making tons of money on you. It's not our fault that like we only see you as a moneymaker. It's actually this immigrant's fault. Like, which of course, like the logic of that is insane because like one, immigrants are a huge economic boon to the United States. It's a massive economic boon to the United States. The other thing is that immigrants in the United States do the jobs that natural born Americans will not do. And so this is not, someone's not coming for your job. Like they are open jobs that are not getting done. And these include like field work and working in and farming and labor, or working in like factory processing food, things like this. Like natural born Americans don't take those jobs. They won't take those jobs. And so like it's actually worse for your economic situation if we Black immigrants coming in, right? But so I mean we've talked so much about like all these things and like how this relates to abortion. The question is here like who controls the narrative of your body, but also who physically controls your body. And if poorer people and if minoritized communities are unable to control the very means of their own reproduction, right? Then they're not a threat to you financially. Like they can never actually get into financial power to challenge financial power. They can never actually get into financial sustainability to then like challenge political power. And like ultimately at the end of the day, a lot of people in power don't care. They just don't care that people are dying. They don't care that people are then we're creating and we're growing the poverty class in the United States, right? At one point, 1 in 2 children in the United States was food insecure, meaning it wasn't clear if every day they were going to have food. 1 in 2. This is insane. During COVID, we put in these President Biden at the time put in these measures. It was almost like a base wage. There were these sort of short-term money grants people could get because they couldn't go to work. And during this time, the rate of child poverty plummeted in the United States. It functioned like a base wage. It wasn't. It was like, you can't work right now, so we're giving you this, but you have to go back to work later, right? But it functioned like a base wage, and poverty plummeted among children. And when those went away, the rates of child poverty increased, right? And I think now 1 in 5 children who live in poverty, and children are most likely to live in poverty. And abortion restrictions only add to that, right? Because abortion restrictions aren't about caring for children. They're not about morality. They're not about this, what it means to be American. Those are all narratives some people may believe, and they're like in their heart of hearts, they may believe that. But they're about controlling people and about government control over the population. And the reason the government wants to do that is money. Money and power, the same thing in the United States, money and power. And that's probably true everywhere, right? But certainly, like, why be in power in Congress? Like, because you get money, you get lots and lots and lots of money. Your salary is not that big in Congress, but that's not where you get your money. You get your money from corporations, you get your money from deals, you get your money because you invested in the stock that now you have helped raise higher and higher and higher, which is not illegal. right? So, I mean, it's a really complicated space. I do think that people are more, it's hard. It's really hard to disentangle people from seeing that actually capitalism is really at the root of so many human rights abuses. It is because of capitalism. Because capitalism is a force. It doesn't have feelings. It doesn't make decisions. The people who like feed into it, right, are doing so because of this idea that they could be richer. And that ultimately, like that is the root cause. It's very, very hard to imagine a future in America where that becomes fully disentangled, where people really start to see this. I do think we're seeing people, and partly with COVID, we saw this where people were like, oh, it's not worth going to this minimum wage job. So we used a very, very low minimum wage, so a minimum amount you had to get paid. And Congress did pass a minimum wage act after much resistance, right? People are like, it's better to not work than to go to work for such bad conditions. But I think those are the types of massive political and social revolutions that are hard to come by, even when people see the impact.